My name is Ezekiel, and I never thought I'd be sharing a story like this. I'm a simple man, an Amish man, raised in a world where faith is as natural as breathing, and every day is guided by the rhythms of tradition. But what I experienced, what happened when I died, has left me with no choice. I can no longer stay silent. The day started like any other. The sun rose over the rolling fields, its light soft and golden, kissing the tops of the barn and glinting off the dewdrops that clung to the tall grass. I remember the sound of the roosters crowing and the distant clatter of horses' hooves as my neighbors set off to market. My wife, Miriam, stood in the doorway with a warm smile, our youngest clinging to her apron strings, as I hitched the wagon and prepared for the trip into town. It wasn't a long journey, but the air held a strange weight that morning, as if the world was holding its breath. The rain started just as I reached the halfway point, soft at first, a gentle patter on the wagon's canvas cover, but soon it grew heavier, turning the dirt road into a slick ribbon of mud. My horse, Samson, struggled to find his footing, his hooves slipping and sliding with each step. I tightened my grip on the reins, urging him forward. "Just a little. Farther, boy," I murmured, though my voice was tight with unease. The rain lashed against my face, cold and biting, and the once familiar road ahead blurred into a treacherous mess of shadows and water. I didn't see the rock until it was too late. It jutted out of the mud, sharp and jagged, and Samson's hoof caught on it with a sickening twist. He reared, the wagon lurching violently to the side, and before I could react, everything came crashing down. I felt the weight of the wagon press against my chest, heard the splintering of wood and the panicked cries of Samson as he thrashed against his harness. Then, there was a sharp, searing pain, and everything went black. At first, there was nothing but silence. Not the kind of silence you find in a quiet room, but a deep, infinite stillness, as if the very fabric of existence had been pulled away. I was aware somehow that my body was lying beneath the wreckage, broken and lifeless, yet I felt no fear or pain. Instead, there was a curious sense of detachment, as though I were watching the scene unfold from a great distance. Then I felt a gentle pull, as if an unseen hand were guiding me upward. The darkness gave way to a soft, golden light, warm and inviting, and I found myself floating, weightless and free. The world below seemed to shrink, the wreckage of the wagon and the rain-soaked road fading into insignificance. All around me was light, not harsh or blinding, but a radiant glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As I moved closer to the source of the light, I became aware of a presence. It wasn't something I saw or heard, but something I felt deep within my soul. It was a presence so overwhelming, so completely filled with love and peace, that I wanted to weep. Every fear, every doubt, every burden I'd ever carried seemed to melt away in its warmth. And then I saw him. At first, he was just a figure in the distance, but as I drew closer, I could make out the details, the flowing robes, the outstretched hands, and the face that seemed to radiate both kindness and authority. It was Jesus. There was no mistaking it. My heart trembled within me, not with fear, but with an awe so profound that I felt unworthy to even look upon him. "Ezekiel," he said, his voice like a melody that resonated through every fiber of my being. "You are not alone." Tears streamed down my face as I fell to my knees before him, my soul laid bare in his presence. "Lord," I whispered, my voice trembling, "I am not worthy to stand before you." But he reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, and the touch was like a balm to my soul. "You are loved," he said, his eyes filled with a compassion that pierced through every wall I'd ever built around my heart. "But there is much you must understand." Suddenly, the light around us shifted, and I found myself standing in a vast open field. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, lush and green, stretching out in every direction under a sky so clear and bright it seemed to sing with life. But as I looked closer, I saw that the field was divided. On one side, the grass grew tall and vibrant, filled with wildflowers that danced in the breeze. On the other it was barren and dry, cracked and lifeless under a sky choked with gray clouds. "Do you see?" Jesus asked, his voice gentle but firm. "This is the world as it is meant to be, and the world as it has become." I felt a deep sadness well up within me as I took in the stark contrast. "Why is it like this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because they have forgotten," he said, his gaze fixed on the barren side. "They have traded love for judgment, grace for rules, and truth for convenience. Even those who claim to follow me have lost their way." I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, the field began to change. The green side started to wither, the wildflowers wilting under the encroaching shadow of the barren land. I watched in horror as the life was drained from it, the two sides becoming one desolate wasteland. "Ezekiel," Jesus said, turning to me, "you have been given much, but there is more you must do. Will you carry this message to those who need it most?" I hesitated, fear and doubt swirling within me. "But I am just one man," I said. "How can I make a difference?" "You are chosen," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Not because you are perfect, but because you are willing." Before I could fully process his words, the scene shifted again, and I was no longer in the field. Instead, I stood in a place that felt both familiar and alien, a small, simple community much like my own. The houses were plain, the people dressed in modest clothing, and the sound of a distant hymn hung in the air like a memory. But there was something wrong. The air was heavy, not with rain as it had been before, but with an unspoken tension. I saw faces I recognized, friends, neighbors, even family members. They moved about their tasks with a quiet efficiency, their hands busy but their eyes empty. It was as if they were going through the motions of life without truly living it. A small group stood in a circle, whispering among themselves, their expressions hard and judgmental. Nearby, a young girl sat on the steps of a house, her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to make herself invisible. "What is this?" I asked, turning to Jesus. "This is a reflection," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "A glimpse of what happens when the heart is forgotten, and only the rules remain." The words hit me like a blow. I looked at the faces again, searching for something, anything, that hinted at joy or peace. But all I saw was fear, guilt, and a desperate need to measure up to a standard that seemed impossibly out of reach. I watched as an older man approached the young girl on the steps. He carried a book in his hand, a Bible, worn and weathered, but his tone was cold as he spoke. "You must repent," he said, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Your sins will bring shame upon us all." The girl's head bowed lower, her small frame trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to—" "Enough," the man interrupted, his tone final. "You know the rules." My chest tightened, anger and sorrow twisting together. Inside me. "How can this be?" I asked, turning to Jesus. "These are good people, God-fearing people. How did it come to this?" "They have forgotten the greatest commandment," he said, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to mirror my own. "To love." The scene before me began to blur, the figures fading into the distance like smoke carried away by the wind. In their place, a new vision emerged, one of light and life. I saw people embracing one another, their faces alight with joy. Children laughed and played, their voices ringing out like music. There was no judgment here, no fear, only love. "This is what I desire," Jesus said, his voice soft but resolute. "A world where grace is not just a word, but a way of life, where love is the foundation and forgiveness flows freely." Tears streamed down my face as I took it all in, the beauty and the hope of it almost too much to bear. But then the vision shifted again, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. The light began to dim, shadows creeping in at the edges. The laughter faded, replaced by whispers, insidious and cunning. I saw people turning away from one another, their faces hardening with suspicion and pride. The division grew, the light shrinking until it was just a flicker, struggling against the encroaching darkness. Even the faithful will be tested, Jesus said, his voice grave. The deception coming is greater than you can imagine. Many will be led astray. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. What can I do? I asked, my voice trembling. How can I stop this? You cannot stop it, he said, his eyes meeting mine. But you can be a light in the darkness. You can remind them of the truth, that salvation is not earned through rules or works, but through grace. That it is not about what they do, but about who they are in me. I felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of fear, doubt, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. The task seemed impossible, the burden too great for one man to bear. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something that steadied me. Trust. He believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Do not be afraid, he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. I am with you, always. Before I could respond, the light around us began to fade, and I felt myself being pulled back. The warmth of his presence lingered, but it grew fainter with each passing moment. I reached out, desperate to hold on, but it was like grasping at smoke. And then, with a jolt, I was back. The first thing I noticed was the sound, the steady, rhythmic beeping of a monitor. It pulled me back, anchoring me to the world I had just left behind. My eyes fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room blinding after the radiant glow I had seen. The air smelled of antiseptic and plastic, a stark contrast to the purity of the fields I had walked in moments ago. Or was it hours? Days? Time felt slippery, impossible to measure in the liminal space I had just crossed. Ezekiel, a voice, called softly, trembling with emotion. It was Miriam. Her face hovered above me, etched with lines of worry and streaked with tears. Her hands gripped mine so tightly that it hurt, and for a moment I wondered if she was afraid I might slip away again. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and my voice came out as little more than a croak. Miriam. Her sob caught her throat, and she nodded frantically, her words tumbling out in a rush. You're awake! Thank God! The doctor said it was a miracle you survived. They weren't sure if you would make it. Oh, Ezekiel, I thought I'd lost you. Her words washed over me, but I couldn't focus on them. My mind was still caught in the otherworldly images, the light, the fields, the voice that had called me to something far greater than myself. I tried to sit up, but pain shot through my body, sharp and unrelenting. I gasped, and Miriam pressed me gently back against the pillow. Don't move, she said, her voice firm despite the tears. You've been through so much. Just rest. But rest was the last thing on my mind. The weight of what I had seen, what I had been told, pressed against my chest like a physical burden. How could I rest when the world was teetering on the edge of something so profound, so devastating? How could I explain to Miriam, to anyone, what I had experienced? The days that followed were a blur of doctors, nurses, and concerned visitors. Everyone called my survival a miracle, a testament to God's grace, but no one seemed to grasp the deeper truth of it. They saw only the surface, my broken body stitched back together by skilled hands and a stroke of divine luck. But I knew better. I had seen the hand of God, felt the pull of eternity, and been given a mission that I couldn't ignore. Miriam was the first person I tried to tell. Late one night, when the hospital had grown quiet and the only light came from the dim lamp by my bed, I reached for her hand. She was sitting in the chair beside me, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but still filled with love. Miriam, I began, my voice low and hesitant. Something happened to me while I was gone. Her brow furrowed and she leaned closer, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. I didn't just lose consciousness. I saw something, someone, Jesus. Her eyes widened and she drew in a sharp breath. Ezekiel. I know it sounds unbelievable, I said quickly, sensing her hesitation. But it was real. He spoke to me, Miriam. He showed me things. Things about the world, about what's coming. He said we've forgotten the greatest commandment, to love. And if we don't remember, if we don't change, the consequences will be devastating. Her hand tightened around mine, and she looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. You truly believe this? I don't just believe it, I said, my voice trembling with conviction. I know it. I felt his presence. I heard his voice, and I can't ignore what he showed me. Miriam was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching mine. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening. Then we will listen, Ezekiel. Together. We will do what he asks. Her words were a balm to my soul, but I knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The Amish community is built on tradition, on rules and order. To question that, to challenge it, was to risk everything, our place, our relationships, our very identity. But the vision burned within me, a fire that refused to be extinguished. Over the weeks that followed, as I regained my strength and returned home, I began to share my story. First with my family, then with close friends. Some listened with wide eyes and open hearts, moved by the passion in my words. Others turned away, their faces set in disbelief or disapproval. You've been through a trauma, one elder said, his tone gentle but firm. Perhaps your mind is playing tricks on you. No, I said, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. And if we don't open our hearts to his message, we risk losing everything. The elder said nothing more, but his silence spoke volumes. I knew then that the road I was walking would be a lonely one, but I also knew it was the right one. The vision had changed me, stripped away the fear and hesitation that had once held me back. I was no longer just Ezekiel, the Amish farmer. I was a man with a purpose, a man who had seen the truth, and there was no turning back. As the weeks stretched into months, the weight of the vision grew heavier. Every decision I made, every word I spoke, felt imbued with a gravity I couldn't escape. At times, it was suffocating, a constant reminder of the task I had been given. But in the quiet moments when the world slowed and the stars shone bright above the darkened fields, I felt his presence. It wasn't loud or forceful, but steady, like a whisper carried on the wind. The community, however, was less forgiving. Word of my near-death experience spread quickly, and with it came the inevitable whispers. People stopped me on the road. Their curiosity mingled with caution. Some asked questions, eager to hear about what I had seen. Others shook their heads, dismissing my story as the product of fevered dreams or an overactive imagination. You've always been a good man, Ezekiel, one neighbor said, his tone measured. But these ideas, they're dangerous. You need to focus on your recovery, on your family. Leave the rest to the elders and the Lord. Dangerous. That word lingered in my mind, echoing through the long nights as I lay awake. Was it dangerous? To speak the truth? To challenge the idea that salvation was earned through rules and rigid adherence to tradition? Jesus hadn't spoken of rules or judgment. He had spoken of love, of grace, of a world transformed by forgiveness and compassion. Miriam remained my steadfast anchor. She listened to my doubts, encouraged me when I faltered, and stood by me even when it felt like the world was turning against us. It was her quiet strength that gave me the courage to speak at a community gathering one evening, despite the knot of fear twisting in my stomach. The meeting was held in a neighbor's barn, the air thick with the scent of hay and the faint aroma of wood smoke. Lanterns cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the murmurs of conversation quieted as I stood to speak. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to meet their gazes. These men and women I had grown up with, whose approval had once meant everything to me. I know many of you have heard about my experience, I began, my voice steady, despite the tremor I felt inside. Some of you believe it and some of you don't. That's fine, but I can't stay silent about what I've seen, what I've been told. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on me. I took a deep breath and continued. Jesus spoke to me, I said, the words hanging heavy in the air. He showed me a world where we've lost our way. Not because we stopped following rules, but because we stopped loving one another. He said salvation isn't about what we do. It's about accepting His grace and sharing it with others. It's about living with open hearts, not closed fists. A ripple of movement ran through the crowd. Some nodded, their expressions thoughtful, while others frowned, their brows furrowed in disapproval. One man, an elder named Samuel, stood. His voice was calm, but laced with authority. "Ezekiel, you speak of love and grace, but what of discipline? What of the commandments given to us by God? Are we to abandon them in favor of some feeling?" I met his gaze, feeling the weight of his question. "I'm not saying we abandon God's commandments," I replied. "But what good are they, if they're followed without love?" Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love the Lord with all your heart, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else flows from that. Samuel shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You tread a dangerous path, Ezekiel. Beware of pride, for it leads even the righteous astray." His words stung, but I refused to back down. "This isn't about pride," I said, my voice rising with emotion. "It's about truth. I've seen what happens when we let fear and judgment replace love. We become blind to what truly matters. We lose sight of Him." The tension in the room was palpable, the silence heavy and charged. Finally, Samuel sat down, his expression unreadable. The meeting ended soon after, the crowd dispersing in uneasy silence. That night, as I walked home, with Miriam, I felt both drained and resolute. The road ahead would be hard. I knew that now, but I also knew I couldn't stop. In the days that followed, the backlash began to ripple through the community. Some avoided me entirely, their gazes averted when we crossed paths. Others confronted me outright, their voices sharp with anger or fear. "You're tearing this community apart," one man said, his face red with frustration. "I'm trying to save it," I replied, my voice steady. But not everyone turned away. A small group began to gather at our home, drawn by the message of hope and grace I shared. They came quietly, their footsteps soft on the dirt path, their faces lit by the dim glow of lanterns. Together we prayed, shared our fears, and sought to understand the vision I had been given. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a start. And as I looked around the room at the faces of those willing to listen, I felt a spark of hope. The road ahead might be long and filled with challenges, but I wasn't walking it alone. As the weeks stretched into months, the weight of the vision grew heavier. Every decision I made, every word I spoke, felt imbued with a gravity I couldn't escape. At times it was suffocating, a constant reminder of the task I had been given. But in the quiet moments when the world slowed and the stars shone bright above the darkened fields, I felt His presence. It wasn't loud or forceful, but steady, like a whisper carried on the wind. The community, however, was less forgiving. Word of my near-death experience spread quickly, and with it came the inevitable whispers. People stopped me on the road. Their curiosity mingled with caution. Some asked questions, eager to hear about what I had seen. Others shook their heads, dismissing my story as the product of fevered dreams or an overactive imagination. "You've always been a good man, Ezekiel," one neighbor said, his tone measured. "But these ideas, they're dangerous. You need to focus on your recovery, on your family. Leave the rest to the elders and the Lord." Dangerous. That word lingered in my mind, echoing through the long nights as I lay awake. Was it dangerous? To speak the truth? To challenge the idea that salvation was earned through rules and rigid adherence to tradition? Jesus hadn't spoken of rules or judgment. He had spoken of love, of grace, of a world transformed by forgiveness and compassion. Miriam remained my steadfast anchor. She listened to my doubts, encouraged me when I faltered, and stood by me even when it felt like the world was turning against us. It was her quiet strength that gave me the courage to speak at a community gathering one evening, despite the knot of fear twisting in my stomach. The meeting was held in a neighbor's barn, the air thick with the scent of hay and the faint aroma of wood smoke. Lanterns cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the murmurs of conversation quieted as I stood to speak. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to meet their gazes. These men and women I had grown up with, whose approval had once meant everything to me. I know many of you have heard about my experience, I began, my voice steady, despite the tremor I felt inside. Some of you believe it, and some of you don't. That's fine, but I can't stay silent about what I've seen, what I've been told. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on me. I took a deep breath and continued. Jesus spoke to me, I said, the words hanging heavy in the air. He showed me a world where we've lost our way, not because we stopped following rules, but because we stopped loving one another. He said salvation isn't about what we do. It's about accepting His grace and sharing it with others. It's about living with open hearts, not closed fists. A ripple of movement ran through the crowd. Some nodded, their expressions thoughtful, while others frowned, their brows furrowed in disapproval. One man, an elder named Samuel, stood. His voice was calm but laced with authority. Ezekiel, you speak of love and grace, but what of discipline? What of the commandments given to us by God? Are we to abandon them in favor of some feeling? I met his gaze, feeling the weight of his question. I'm not saying we abandon God's commandments, I replied. But what good are they if they're followed without love? Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love the Lord with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else flows from that. Samuel shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. You tread a dangerous path, Ezekiel. Beware of pride, for it leads even the righteous astray. His words stung, but I refused to back down. This isn't about pride, I said, my voice rising with emotion. It's about truth. I've seen what happens when we let fear and judgment replace love. We become blind to what truly matters. We lose sight of Him. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence heavy and charged. Finally, Samuel sat down, his expression unreadable. The meeting ended soon after, the crowd dispersing in uneasy silence. That night, as I walked home with Miriam, I felt both drained and resolute. The road ahead would be hard, I knew that now, but I also knew I couldn't stop. In the days that followed, the backlash began to ripple through the community. Some avoided me entirely, their gazes averted when we crossed paths. Others confronted me outright, their voices sharp with anger or fear. You're tearing this community apart, one man said, his face red with frustration. I'm trying to save it, I replied, my voice steady. But not everyone turned away. A small group began to gather at our home, drawn by the message of hope and grace I shared. They came quietly, their footsteps soft on the dirt path, their faces lit by the dim glow of lanterns. Together we prayed, shared our fears, and sought to understand the vision I had been given. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a start. And as I looked around the room, at the faces of those willing to listen, I felt a spark of hope. The road ahead might be long and filled with challenges, but I wasn't walking it alone. The nights grew quieter, the whispers softer but still present. The weight of what I carried seemed to shift, no longer a solitary burden, but a shared calling among those who gathered in our home. Each meeting brought a new story, a new confession of doubts and fears, but also an undeniable yearning for something deeper than the life we'd known. One evening, a young man named Jonas spoke up. He was barely 20, his hands calloused from years of working the fields, his eyes bright with a hunger for understanding. Ezekiel, he began, his voice trembling. I've followed the rules my whole life. I've done everything I was told to do, but I've never felt close to Him. Not like you describe. Why is that? The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me. I could feel the weight of their expectation, their hope. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. Jonas, I said gently, rules are meant to guide us, to point us toward God, but they're not the destination. If we follow them without love, without truly opening our hearts to Him, they become empty rituals. What He wants isn't our perfection. It's our trust, our willingness to let Him into the broken, messy parts of our lives. Jonas nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. But how do I do that? How do I let him in? I smiled, feeling the warmth of the Spirit move through me. You start by being honest, with him, with yourself. Tell him your fears, your doubts, ask him to show you the way, and then listen. He speaks in ways we don't always expect, but he's always there, waiting for us to turn to him. Yonachu lowered his head, his lips moving in silent prayer. Around the room, others bowed their heads, the stillness broken only by the soft creak of the wooden floorboards and the faint rustle of the wind outside. As the weeks passed, the small group grew. What began as a handful of people meeting in secret became a quiet movement within the community. Each person who joined brought their own struggles, their own stories of longing and doubt. And with each gathering, the vision I had been given became clearer, its urgency more pressing. But with growth came resistance. The elders called a special meeting, summoning me to defend what they saw as a dangerous deviation from our ways. The gathering was held in the church, its wooden pews filled with solemn faces. The air was heavy with tension as I stood before them, my heart pounding in my chest. Ezekiel, Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. You have caused great unrest in our community. Your teachings sow division and confusion. We must ask you plainly, do you reject the Ordnung and the ways of our fathers? I met his gaze, feeling the eyes of the entire congregation on me. I don't reject the Ordnung, I said carefully, but I believe it's not enough. Jesus didn't come to bind us with more rules. He came to set us free. Free to love, to forgive, to live in his grace. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others frowning in disapproval. Samuel raised his hand for silence. And do you believe you alone have been given this revelation? That you are somehow above the guidance of the church? The question stung, but I held my ground. I don't believe I'm above anyone, I replied. I'm just a man, a flawed, imperfect man who was shown something I can't ignore. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I know what I saw, what I felt. And I believe it was his way of calling us back to what truly matters. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding in Samuel's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. You leave us with much to consider, he said finally. But know this, Ezekiel. Unity is the foundation of our community. Without it, we crumble. I nodded, understanding the warning beneath his words. As I left the church that night, Miriam by my side, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. The path I was walking was growing narrower, the divide between me and the community wider. But as I looked at the stars above, their light unwavering despite the darkness, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just my burden to carry, it was his. And as long as I walked in his light, I knew I wouldn't walk alone. In the days that followed, I began to see small changes. I knew the time was coming when I would have to make a choice, to stay and fight for change within the community, or to step away and continue the work elsewhere. The decision weighed heavily on my heart, but as I prayed, I felt a quiet assurance. Whatever path lay ahead, I wouldn't walk it alone. He was with me, guiding me, strengthening me, and that was enough. The final gathering at our home felt different. The room was filled with a quiet, almost reverent energy, as if everyone present understood the weight of what we were about to discuss. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls, and the scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air. Miriam sat beside me, her presence a steadying force. Jonas was there too, his youthful energy tempered by a newfound seriousness. Even Samuel had come, his expression guarded but curious. The tension between us lingered, but his presence alone was a small miracle, a testament to the quiet ways the Spirit works. I stood and looked around the room, my heart full and heavy at once. These people had become more than neighbors and friends. They were fellow travelers on this journey of faith. I took a deep breath, letting the silence settle before I spoke. My friends, I began, We've come a long way together. Each of you has taken a step of faith simply by being here, and for that I'm grateful. But tonight, I feel called to share one final part of the vision I was given, a part I've kept to myself until now. The room grew still, every eye fixed on me. I closed my own for a moment, recalling the vivid images that had haunted me since that fateful day. "I saw a great storm," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside me. It wasn't just a storm of wind and rain. It was a storm of fear, confusion, and division. It swept through the world, leaving destruction in its wake. But amidst the chaos, there was a light, a small, flickering light that grew brighter and brighter as more people were drawn to it. I paused, letting the image sink in. That light wasn't a building or a leader. It wasn't tied to any one tradition or community. It was his love, pure, unshakable, and eternal. And the people who carried that light weren't perfect. They weren't chosen because of their knowledge or their works. They were chosen because they were willing to trust him, to follow him even when it meant stepping into the unknown. A murmur rippled through the room, a mixture of awe and unease. I met Samuel's gaze, seeing the flicker of understanding I'd hoped for. "We are being called," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "Not to abandon everything we've known, but to look beyond it. To see his work in places and people we might not expect. To let go of the fear that binds us and step into the freedom of his grace." Jonas raised his hand, his face lit with a mix of hope and concern. "But what about the storm? How do we prepare for it?" I nodded, grateful for his courage to ask the question. "We prepare by anchoring ourselves in him," I said. "By praying, by loving, by living with open hearts. The storm will test us, it will test everyone. But if we hold on to him, if we trust in his promises, we will endure, and we will shine his light for others to see." The room fell silent again, the weight of the message settling over us like a blanket. I felt tears prick my eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead and the strength it would require. As the evening drew to a close, people lingered, their conversations hushed but earnest. Samuel approached me, his face unreadable. For a moment, we stood in silence, the firelight dancing between us. "Ezekiel," he said finally, his voice. "Though I don't know if I fully understand what you've seen, but I can't deny the truth in your words. The storm is coming, I feel it too, and I want to be ready." His admission felt like a crack in the wall that had stood between us, and I reached out to clasp his hand. "You will be, Samuel. We all will be if we stand together." In the days that followed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The path ahead was still uncertain, the challenges daunting, but I no longer carried the burden alone. The vision had taken root in the hearts of those around me, and together we began to prepare, not out of fear, but out of faith. And so the story continues, not as an ending, but as a beginning. The storm will come, as storms always do, but in its wake, I believe there will be something greater, something brighter. Not because of anything we've done, but because of who he is. As I write this, the frost clings to the windows, the fire crackles softly, and Miriam hums a hymn in the next room. The world feels both fragile and full of promise, a reminder of the balance we all walk. And though I don't know what tomorrow holds, I know this: the light will not go out, his love will endure. And that, above all else, is enough. People who had once turned away now stopped to talk, their questions tentative but genuine. The gatherings in our home continued, each one a testament to the quiet but steady work of the Spirit. Yet, the vision remained at the forefront of my a constant reminder of the stakes. I knew I couldn't stop here. The message was too important, the warning too urgent. The time was coming when we would all be tested, and I could only hope we would be ready. The chill of winter began to settle over the fields, the frost painting the earth in delicate patterns each morning. Life in the community continued as it always had, chores, gatherings, and the rhythm of work that defined our days. But beneath the surface there was a quiet tension, a sense of something shifting. I felt it most strongly during the moments of stillness, when I was alone in the barn or walking through the woods. It was as though the vision had taken root, not just in my mind, but in the very air around me, its weight pressing against my spirit. I spent hours in prayer, seeking clarity, asking for strength. One night, as I sat by the fire with Miriam, she reached for my hand. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Whatever happens, Ezekiel, you don't have to face it by yourself." Her words were a balm to my weary heart. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "I know, Miriam, and I thank God for you every day, but sometimes I wonder, am I doing enough? Am I saying the right things? What if I fail?" She looked at me, her eyes steady. "You won't fail. Not if you're speaking his truth, and even if you stumble, he'll use it for good. You've already planted seeds, Ezekiel. Trust him to make them grow." Her faith bolstered mine, and as I lay awake that night, I felt a renewed determination. The message I'd been given wasn't just for me, it was for everyone, and I couldn't let fear or doubt hold me back. The next morning I decided to visit Samuel. Though we had clashed at the meeting, I respected him deeply. He was a man of conviction, a pillar of the community. If anyone could understand the urgency of the vision, it was him. The walk to his home was long, the air crisp and biting. I prayed with every step, asking for the right words, for wisdom and grace. When I arrived, Samuel greeted me with a cautious smile, his eyes betraying his surprise. "Ezekiel," he said, motioning for me to enter. "What brings you here?" "I needed to speak with you," I said, my voice steady, "about everything, the vision, the message, what it all means." He nodded slowly, gesturing for me to sit. The room was warm, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. "Samuel," I began, "I know we don't see eye to eye on this, but I need you to understand I didn't ask for this vision. I didn't seek it out. It was given to me and I can't ignore it. I believe it's a warning, a call to turn back to what truly matters." Samuel studied me, his expression unreadable. "And what do you believe truly matters, Ezekiel?" "Love," I said simply. "Grace, trusting in him, not in our own works or traditions. I believe he's calling us to let go of the things that divide us and focus on what unites us, his love." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "And you think our traditions are a hindrance to that?" "Not in themselves," I said quickly. "But when they become more important than the heart of the gospel, yes. When we judge others by how well they follow the rules instead of how they love, we lose sight of him." The silence that followed was heavy, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Finally, Samuel sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Ezekiel," he said quietly, "I don't doubt your sincerity, and I don't doubt that you had an experience, something profound. But this community has thrived for generations because of its unity, its commitment to the Ordnung. What you're asking, it's not just a change, it's a risk." I nodded, understanding his fear. "It is a risk," I admitted. "But isn't faith always a risk? Isn't that what he asks of us, to step out and trust even when we're afraid?" He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the fire. I stood, sensing the conversation was over. "Thank you for listening," I said, my voice quiet. "I'll be praying for you, Samuel." As I walked home, I felt a strange mixture of hope and sorrow. I didn't know if I had reached him, if my words had planted even the smallest seed. But I had done what I could, and that had to be enough. The days that followed were a blur of activity. The gatherings at our home grew larger, the conversations deeper. People began sharing their own experiences, their own moments of doubt and revelation. It was as if the vision had awakened something in all of us, a hunger for more, for him. But with growth came danger. The elders' disapproval grew louder, their warnings more pointed. If this story moved you or gave you a sense of hope, please share it with others. Together, we can spread his light and love to those who need it most. Let us stay vigilant, rooted in faith, and unafraid to trust in his plan.